Good morning, good morning. Let's open with a prayer. Oh, dear Heavenly Father, praise you, Father, and thank you so much for your word and for this study in Exodus. You continue to help us to understand your word and help us to glean information that's pertinent to our understanding of our own lives and how it fits in well with the things to come. And we look forward to your helping us to understand your word. In Jesus' precious name I pray. Amen. Okay, I stopped a little early yesterday because we were getting into a portion. I didn't want to have to run too long. I seem to have figured out myself, and maybe it's just me, but when a video gets a little bit too long, people have a tendency to lose interest towards like an hour, particularly an hour. I think is a bit long. I remember a study once that when I was learning in the military about teaching, that there was things that were kind of mentioned to try to break up your lesson so that you didn't lose the student and something that would have to go over it again because of making lectures too long. So that's why I think that if you go to even an hour, it can be a little bit tedious to take that much information in. So if I'm wrong on that, I wouldn't mind a little input on it. Maybe it's just me. But so let's continue in Exodus 4, starting in verse 8 to verse 26. And I think we'll finish this today because yesterday I had added in that additional stuff about the Gulf of Aqaba and the actual site. And actually today I just got a couple of pictures I'll show you on that same subject, only because we're still in Midian, and they actually found a city they believe is the city that Moses was at, where he met his wife and worked for. We'll get to his name here in a minute. So let's get some verses going. And I'll bring up this map that I got. That little red dot there is a city that they found a village. Let me get it a little bit closer. That's Midian. We're going to mention that today. It's in the Bible. And this is the mountain over here that I believe is the mountain that Mount Sinai. It's named now because it's in Saudi Arabia. It is Jebel al-Lawaz. This is an actual current map of Saudi Arabia. And just for the heck of it, I'll just show it to you now. That picture of the it's not in there. There's the picture of the city dwellings they found in that town, and the well that most likely Moses met these 7 daughters of would become his father-in-law. And again, I'm drawing a blank on his name. I know it starts with a J. I know I got it in my notes. I just got to find it. Well, we're going to see it in the verses here in a minute, rather than me wasting a bunch of time trying to find it. So let's get into the verses. And first of all, we're going to talk about, so I'll leave it right here because this is where Moses most likely is when God was talking to him in this general area. He's still in Midian. And it shall come to pass, if they will not believe thee, neither they hearken to thy voice of thy first sign, and they will believe the voice of the latter sign. When we left off, God was talking to Moses, had given him his instructions about going to Egypt and about freeing his people. And he gave him a couple of signs. He gave him a sign where you take his rod and throw it to the ground. It turns into a snake. We talked about that one and the fact that it symbolizes the throwing down of Satan to the earth. And when we get to the actual, when Moses used it in front of Pharaoh, we're going to see that Satan is represented by the snakes that gets eaten up. And then he talked about sticking his hand in his bosom. He basically stuck it into his shirt. When he pulled it out, it turned all white, like he had leprosy. Leprosy was a very common illness back then, and it was deadly. You died from it usually. So it'd be very drastic for Moses to use. And then when he stuck his hand back in again and pulled it out, it was brand new again. So he's got one more God is going to teach him. And this one here, I think, has a really interesting side note because of our study in Revelation. So here, so it shall come to pass, when you not believe the other, then he'll believe what's coming. Verse 9. And it shall come to pass that thou wilt not believe also these two signs, neither hearken unto thy voice. And thou shalt take of the water of the river, and pour it upon the dry land. And the water which thou takest out of the river shall become blood upon the dry land. So here the water to blood will become a signature sign Moses uses here as a symbol of what Pharaoh did unto the Hebrews. And this goes back to what, remember what we talked about in the beginning, that Pharaoh had ordered all the babies thrown into the Nile River that were boys to kill them. So blood for blood. And so this is going to be symbolic of what God is going to show Pharaoh here through Moses, is that you killed my children, I'm going to kill your children. That's what we're leading up to. But that let's just review real quick some of those verses we were talking about in Exodus 1:22. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. When you jump ahead to Exodus 7, we're going to see this come into play when it comes to what Moses is doing with this blood to water. Exodus 7:19 through 25, I'm going to read right now. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, say unto Aaron, take thy rod and stretch out thine hand upon the waters of Egypt, upon the streams, upon the rivers, upon their ponds, and upon all the pools of water, that they may become blood, and that they may be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, both in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. And Moses and Aaron did so as the Lord commanded, and he lifted up the rod and smote the waters that were in the river, in the sight of Pharaoh, and in the sight of his servants, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And the fish that was in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the water of the river, and there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Neither did he hearken unto them as the Lord had said. We'll get into that more when we get to that chapter, because some of this stuff even Satan can do. So his magicians, with the power of Satan, are going to simulate some of this stuff. And Pharaoh turned and went into his house. Neither did he set his heart to this also. And all the Egyptians digged around the river for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the river. So they're trying to find filtered water by digging into the ground. And 7 days were fulfilled after that the Lord had smitten the river. So the reason I read this whole thing, and also in Matthew 7:2, for with what judgment, this is Jesus speaking, ye judge, you shall also be judged. And what measure ye met, it shall be measured to you again. So that basically, because Pharaoh was using a similar technique to kill the Hebrew children, God here is representing that by turning the water into blood. And I think this actually goes into the future, because you're going to see this same thing happen during the tribulation. I just point to a few verses on that. In Revelation, it's one of the signature powers we're going to see of one of the two witnesses. In Revelation 8:8, and the second angel sounded, as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and a third part of the sea became blood. Then jump into 11:6. This is where the two witnesses, these have power to shut heaven that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and they have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues as often as they will. And one more, jump into Revelation 16:3 and 4. And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as blood of the dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. So I'm getting at here. What I'm getting at here is that right now God is showing the Hebrews he's using these against the Egyptians to get them out of Egypt. That was to get them out of to save them from their evil imprisonment. But also with a dual concept I can see now that God is showing them these plagues because he knows in the future there's going to be a future generation that does not know God. They don't recognize God, but they also don't believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. So these two witnesses I'm talking about in Revelation are going to be sent. And a lot of people believe one of them is going to be a reincarnated, not reincarnated, but that God is going to bring Moses back to life. And he's going to be one of those witnesses. And he has the power to turn water to blood. And the one thing that the current Jews only believe in the Old Testament. So for them to realize what's going on here, they're going to see these plagues happening during the time of Jacob's trouble. And they're going to correlate it to the what we're reading right now in Exodus and also in Deuteronomy and other places. And they're going to be able to see the correlation between what happened in the past to what's happening in the present. Put two and two together. Now, these two witnesses that are doing this, most people believe are Elijah and Moses, are going to be preaching that Jesus Christ is the Messiah and trying to convince the people that they missed their Messiah and to repent now and to seek out the Lord. So that's the whole idea behind the time of Jacob's trouble. So that's why I think that this whole plague thing that's going to be happening, and the fact that God plans on doing all of them. I know that they were going to see Moses keeps going back to Pharaoh, but every time he goes back to Pharaoh, God says, I hardened his heart, meaning that he's not going to give in until we actually get to the last plague. And he actually gives a warning of that plague is going to be now, even in the beginning. And we're going to see that here today. Oh, he's not going to tell he's going to tell, God is telling Moses, and then Moses will end up telling Pharaoh later on. So continuing, Exodus 4:10. And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent. So here comes the excuses. Next excuse. I am not eloquent, neither herefore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of slow tongue. Some people take that verse and they believe that maybe in the beginning that Moses had a stuttering problem, that his ability to speak publicly was not that good. Verse 11, and the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb or deaf, or the seeing or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thou what thou shalt say. So this is God speaking. And I actually believe it's a pre-incarnated Jesus Christ who's speaking here. There's a still call coming out of that burning bush. And he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. So he's basically saying here, send someone else. I really don't think I'm up to this challenge. And now God's going to get a little upset with him. But first, now Moses is trying to find ways of get out of doing it. There are legends that Moses may have had a stuttering problem. But again, with God, all things are possible. Actually, Paul felt the same way. And with God's help, his message was powerful, and he became one of the most powerful evangelists of all time. But Paul even mentions this back in 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 4. And I, brethren, when I came to you, could not with excellency of speech or of wisdom declare unto you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. And jumping over to 2 Corinthians 10:10. But his letters say that they are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. And also 2 Corinthians 11:6. But though I be rude in speech, yet not in knowledge, but we have been thoroughly made manifest among you in all things. So Paul is basically saying here is that I by myself could do nothing. It was God working through me that I was able to gain the ability to speak to you. Plus, there's actually a contradicting report, or God really did give Moses the power to speak well. He does a lot of preaching during the time in the wanderings, depending on how far we go into this. If we decide to continue on through the Bible, we're going to see going through Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy that he was quite the orator. And Luke over in Acts 7:22 makes an interesting comment about this. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds. So it makes it sound like that he was a good orator and was very intelligent. So either he became that way through God's help, or he was, or he was just nervous and just wanted to try to find an excuse not to have to go through it. Was not looking forward to it. But I can't help but think about my own situation because I was the kid that never. I remember in high school, I had trouble talking publicly at all, and that I always got nervous. And even if you've been around me, even at church for the longest time, when I would try to pray in church, I would be all fumbly and nervous whenever I got in front of people. And so maybe it's the fact I do it this way that I don't feel as nervous someday when I actually stand in front of people. But I've actually given some classes in the military. So I think that over time I've gotten better at trying to teach. But particularly if it's something I'm well versed in, I seem to get less nervous. So I think maybe that's a little bit about what Moses went through, is that through time God actually trained him to be better at what he called him to do. And I truly believe that on anybody. If God called you to it, he will get you through it. So continuing on here in verse 14. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well, and also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee. And when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. So somehow God had somehow put it in his brother's idea. I realize his brother is in Egypt right now, but he's heading this way towards Midian. I guess God had whispered in his ear, because here God is telling him that his brother is going to be heading his way. And we're going to find out here in the next few verses he's going to meet up with him pretty soon. So basically God is going to give the job of talking to Aaron, and then Moses is just going to be there kind of like as the silent partner. Continuing here, verse 15. And thou shalt speak unto him and put words in his mouth, and I will be with thy mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. So God's promising here to help him learn how to be a better orator. And he shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of a God. I think that basically God was saying there is that every time God wanted to give instructions to the people, God would always go through Moses. So that all the instructions would go through Moses, and Moses would basically give them to Aaron to speak to the people. So he found a way around it. But that's why a lot of people believe that he had a pretty severe stuttering problem and couldn't put together sentences really well. But I think that changed over time. So God knew better, but gave Moses some help with his brother Aaron, and who just happened to be in Midian looking for him. What a coincidence. I don't believe so. The Jewish people say that there's no such thing as a coincidence, that all things are ordained by God. But also never underestimate the power of God, which I feel also myself inadequate. That's one reason I feel led by the Lord to do what I'm doing. I never was as I already mentioned to you. But it's funny how through weakness, God makes us stronger. Paul talks about this in 2 Corinthians 12:10. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and necessities and persecutions and distress for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So Paul feeling the same way. Okay, verse 17. And thou shalt take this rod in thy hand, whether thou shalt do signs. So God has basically made this object, this rod, his way of bringing the power of God through to Moses. You got some interesting verses that go along with this in Exodus 7:9, talking about rods. When Pharaoh shall speak unto you, saying, show a miracle for you, and thou shalt say unto Aaron, take thy rod and cast it before Pharaoh, and it shall become a serpent. Also Exodus 7:19. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying unto Aaron, take thy rod and stretch out thy hand upon the waters of Egypt, upon their streams, upon their rivers. Oh, we already read this a few minutes ago. Turn it to blood. And 1 Corinthians 1:27. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. The old idea behind he who is last shall be first, and he who is first shall be last. In other words, people that are not willing to at least try. I'm saying it the wrong way. When God brings you to something, don't do your best to try to do it, and God will help you with it. And but people who think they don't need any help from God, they're going to be last, is what basically it's saying. Okay, back to Exodus 4:18. And Moses went and returned to Jethro. That is his name, Jethro. So the buildings you see behind there could have been one of those buildings there that Jethro lived in with his 7 daughters. And again, this particular place is right here in Midian. And just further proof, I love when they find archaeology to prove the Bible. It just confirms the Bible. I know the Bible's all true, but I just think it's great when we can find archaeology to sustain it. And of course, this is Mount Ararat. This is the Mount Sinai that I believe that Moses received the information from. Where actually Moses is right this minute while we're talking here in Exodus. He's in front of the burning bush. And if you look real closely, you can almost see that there's a little dark spot on top where the green marker is. But that would be those pictures I was showing you the other day. Which we can look at them again. If anybody's new here, that's the top of the mountain where it's black. And that's the mountain from a distance. So that would be looking like we're standing over here somewhere. Oh, I don't have that map up right now. Let me see if I can switch back and forth easily. See, that would be basically standing over here. You can see my cursor about where that WZ is. So that would be what you would be seeing in that picture, which show there is looking at that mountain. And here's a little bit more close up. You see how dark that top is. This could be the actual area where Moses, there's my leprosy pictures. So, and that's from the top looking down. So that town will probably be down below there somewhere, off in the distance. I'm not sure how far that is. Okay. So this might be about where where Moses is right this minute, on top of that mountain as we're speaking. Back to verses. Verse 19. The Lord said unto Moses in Midian, go, return into Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought thy life. So that the whole reason that Moses left, if you remember correctly, was because he was being chased by Pharaoh. There's actually a note in the Septuagint version of this Bible in the Old Testament that actually mentions that that the Pharaoh that wanted to kill Moses has died. And Moses took his wife and his sons and set them upon an ass, and he returned to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the rod of God in his hand. So now it's got a name, the rod of God. We see this again in Numbers 20, verse 8 and 9. Take the rod and gather thy assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his waters, and I shall bring forth to them water out of the rock, so they shall give the congregation and their beasts drink. This is that famous rock with the crack in it. And Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. If I ever showed you that picture, let me show you real quick. There it is there. Most people believe that's the rock that the water was coming out of, particularly since if you look at the rocks coming down the side of the slope from there, but they're actually smooth, like water was running over the top of them for quite a while. So who knows how long the water was actually running. It was enough to feed all the people. We're talking 3 million people, plus all their animals and all their livestock. Okay, back to Exodus 21. And the Lord said unto Moses, when thou goest to return into Egypt, see that thou do all these wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in thine hand. But I will harden his heart, that he shall not let the people go. See here, God's going to fulfill his plan no matter what Pharaoh does. He's going to make it so Pharaoh is not going to give in until the very last plague. He's even going to give a warning right now of what that plague is going to be. Verse 22. And thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, thus saith the Lord, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. So here God is basically saying that the people that you are oppressing, I consider to be my firstborn as my children, and you're oppressing them. So if you don't listen to me, then this is the consequences. In verse 23, and I say unto thee, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn. So here the warning is going to be given to Pharaoh even before all the other plagues. Verse 24. Now this is a very strange, something I just want to mention about that last verse, something we need to remember even when they are not at the moment being faithful to God. This is important too. It doesn't change the fact that they are still his people. And being anti-Semitic in any way, shape, or form is not a good idea. I'm not saying you can't defend yourself. If you're being attacked by somebody, even if they're Jewish, you don't just give in to whatever they say to do, particularly if it's against God, because a lot of them don't even believe in God. But that realize that once you cross that line of being anti-Semitic, that God is going to be against you. And I worry sometimes about some of these people that are trying to do things to hurt or do things against what God has in plan for Israel. It's going to come back to haunt them. I'm pretty sure God has a special place picked out in hell for those who participate in the Holocaust, particularly, and primary among them is Hitler. He may have repented, but highly doubt it. We don't know he committed suicide. We don't know what if he made up with God beforehand. That would be a real shocker to see him in heaven. But some of his henchmen that were doing his dirty deeds to the Hebrews, the Jewish nation, in the Holocaust, they were ruthless in their dealings with him. I mean, torture would be a mild statement. Pretty sad state. So I can't imagine that God is very happy with a lot of them. Okay, back to that verse 24. This is a strange verse, but it reveals the third real objection of Moses. He had neglected to circumcise his son. So let's read through this section. And it came to pass by the way to the end that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Now all of a sudden the Lord wants to kill Moses. He just gave him this job to do. That's why it's such a strange verse. But it's about circumcision. And circumcision was instituted way before the law was. It was actually instituted back in Genesis 17:14. So let me just look at that real quick. And the uncircumcised man child whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant. Again, this is directed at the Jewish nation. It has a lot to do with about without the shedding of blood. This is what I believe. Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission for sin. And it's symbolic that by the shedding of blood, we're recognizing the promise of God that had made to Abraham. It's a requirement for a Jewish man. I wouldn't say it's a requirement for anyone else, but that a lot of people used to do it in my generation, more because of cleanliness, I think, not because of a religious belief. But here we see that God is so upset with him not circumcising his son that he's actually going to kill him for it. And his wife actually has to step in. So back to verse 25. Then Sapphira, that's his wife, took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at his feet and said, surely a bloody husband art thou to me. So he let him go, and then she said, a bloody husband thou art because of the circumcision. And I looked through some commentaries, and the best explanation I could come up with, that God had to forcefully remind Moses of his disobedience. So to save Moses' life, his wife performed the task and realized even she seemed to disregard this commandment, as even though she was a descendant of Abraham through Keturah, which is was Abraham's second wife, she would have been under that same law also, not her personally, but any children she had. So it seems to become a strife in their marriage as Moses sends her home to her father at one point, but later on make up after the Exodus. And just a few other notes on this that I read that J. Vernon McGee had commented about, and I just kind of paraphrased it. He had a couple of long paragraphs about it. But also his wife did obey and perform the task which she had thought a foolish ritual. So what they're basically saying is that way back when their son was born, what most people figure is that she was against the circumcision, and Moses went along with it rather than have strife in his family. Being a fairly new, like I said, he was definitely circumcised because he was 3 months old when he was put in the basket. And the Hebrews do it on the 8th day. So he was definitely circumcised, but he ignored the law, or maybe even at first before he got to Midian, while he was in Egypt. He probably didn't really know about the law, being he was being raised by the Egyptians, and I'm not sure how they feel about it either way. But it's only been through the years. It's only been a requirement by that I've ever heard of the Jewish nation. And it's very symbolic to the idea of that there's no forgiveness of sins without the shedding of blood. Well, Jesus Christ died on the cross, and he shed our blood. But here God is making it a point that he's expecting Moses to go into Egypt and to stand up for his people when he can't even stand up and do what's right when it comes to his own children and his own family. And so that's why God is making him making a point here that he needs to follow through and do all the Jewish laws before he even gets to Egypt. So that's what this situation is about. But the funny thing is that if you see there in verse 26, so he let him go. This was after the circumcision. So when this happened at the end, God actually pinned him to the floor or something, held him back, and was going to kill him. And I can imagine is that God said, because you didn't circumcise your son, I'm going to kill you. And this is where his wife stood in and had to do the task. I'm thinking to myself that was it her originally that was partially the problem. But you can see by her reaction and what she said to Moses that she was really despised this ritual. This was her baby, her children, and she didn't want to hurt them in any way. I can imagine at this point the children are a lot older. A young baby probably wouldn't even remember it. But his wife did obey and perform the task which she had thought a foolish ritual, but at this point realized how serious it was. She still was not happy with her husband, though. And in verse 26 there, it seems to indicate she had to do it because somehow Moses was held against his will. God would not let the mission proceed until it was done. While God was also letting his wife know she had to also be obedient to God as Moses was going to be. A good reason why being unequally yoked with an unbeliever in a marriage will be a real problem. I've even seen it between people of different faiths. If one wife has a different faith-based system than the husband, it can cause a lot of strife, particularly through like between like Catholics and Protestants would be one I'd think of. But even in some denominational differences between like Methodists and Baptists and so on. So that's all I was going. This is all I was going to look at today, and I'm going to stop there. And they're on their journey to Egypt, but we're going to continue towards Egypt tomorrow, and we'll finish up this chapter, going to the next one. And I just thought I mentioned too that keep in mind that sometimes I haven't done it a lot, but sometimes I'm going to be actually go over between two different chapters in a period of time, because the stories don't always line up with the chapter divisions. Chapter divisions were a man's invention. They were never ordained by God per se, and so that they sometimes stop in weird places that don't seem logical. Here's one of them where we're going to end chapter 4, but really the next section starts in the next verse 27, but it continues into chapter 5. And another one I can think of is Matthew 23 and 24. The last couple of verses of chapter 23 really belong in chapter 24. So just a couple of examples. So don't hold any kind of thing that is God ordained that the chapter divisions are there. That was actually done in two phases. First, it was just chapter divisions, and then someone came along and numbered all the sentences into verses. Okay, just an easier way for us to find things in the Bible. There's nothing anti-God about it that I've ever heard. So let's end with a prayer. Oh, dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time we get to spending your word. And thank you so much for the explanation as to some of the, when you give your marching orders, you expect people to listen and that we could do our best to know that you will always give us the tools we need to perform whatever you ask us to do. We give you praise and thanks so much, Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Okay. You guys have a good day, and we will talk again tomorrow.